welcome. We are thrilled to have you. And just a little bit of background about the MDI Biological Laboratory. For those of you who may not be familiar, we were founded in 1898 and have a long history here on Mount Desert Island. Actually, 100 years ago this year, we relocated to Mount Desert Island at the invitation of George Dorr. And Dorr believed very strongly that Mount Desert Island should be a place where scientists and naturalists and citizens could study nature, learn from nature, and potentially use some of those lessons that we learn by studying nature to help improve human health. So with that, we offer a monthly, actually bi-monthly series of science cafes in the summer. And this evening, we are particularly excited to have author, columnist, and naturalist Jim Wright with us. And Jim has recently written a new book called The Real James Bond. And so some of you may be familiar with the real James Bond's longstanding connection to Mount Desert Island. And for some of you, maybe this is the first time you've heard of this subject, but I'm currently reading the book. It's a delightful read. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, I encourage you to do so. But in the meantime, I am very, very pleased to introduce Jim Wright to you this evening. And Jim is going to tell us more about the real James Bond.
Hi, everybody. I want to thank the MDI Science Cafe for inviting me to speak, and thank you all for attending tonight. That was the Birdman from the cover of my book, and in case you're wondering, it was a Cuban green woodpecker. So should I get rolling here? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get going. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm going to speak today about the real James Bond, Mount Desert Island, and some of the birds that are here, and James Bond's famous uncle from here as well. So let's get going. I'm going to start to get you in the flavor of 007 and what the real James Bond went through later in life when 007 made the famous connection. So here we go. You have to watch very I think this is James Bond's greatest disguise. I think that's where the term gullible comes from. If you saw the movie Goldfinger, you'll remember that Bond takes off that scuba diving outfit and then is wearing a tuxedo. So welcome, my name is Jim Wright. Like the real James Bond, I am a Philly boy. Like James Bond, I go by Jim. I like birds, and my middle name even begins with a B. So I guess I was destined to write this book. Here's a question I hope you'll be able to answer, if not now, by the end of the show. Who was the real James Bond named after? He keeps popping up on Trivia Geniuses and crossword puzzles. And the question is, was James Bond a real-life spy, the creator's neighbor, an ornithologist, or a UK prime minister? I think you probably know the answer already. So a little about the book. It's published by Schiffer, and they did a beautiful job with it. On the cover is the Birdman. It is a Cuban green woodpecker, and I'd like to think that is my body that the bird is attached to. So far, I've achieved 3 really cool things that I never thought possible, but I received good reviews in the Wall Street Journal and the Times Literary Supplement in in London. I made the British tabloids, which I never thought I'd ever happen, but they did it up right. 007 creators stole the name of a naturalist who also had a license to kill birds. And on the cover, I was disappointed I wasn't on the cover, but a couple of women named Kate and Megan were on the cover, and I'm not sure, but I think they're ornithologists as well. So my third goal was, thrill was speaking to so many people about Jim Bond, unfortunately via Zoom. And when I did the first talk live, but I wore a mask as a joke, and now it's kind of a weird joke because of the whole Zoom stuff and COVID. So bear with me, and thanks for showing up tonight. This is the scene of the crime, GoldenEye, Jamaica. And this is the opening of the book read by Raphael Corkill. So just listen in, you'll get an idea of the flavor of the book.
Introduction. A spy is born. The name of a man is a numbing blow from which he never recovers. Marshall McLuhan, Understanding Media. This is the story of the most notorious case of identity theft in history. Long before Ian Lancaster Fleming became a best-selling author, a single-minded Philadelphia ornithologist named James Bond wrote Birds of the West Indies based on repeated expeditions to the Bahamas and the Caribbean from 1927 to 1935. The 480-page book, published in 1936, featured black and white line drawings of birds by noted artist Earl Poole. It quickly became the must-have book on the subject. Fast forward to early 1952. Fleming was starting to flesh out his maiden 007 novel, Casino Royale, and needed a name for his imaginary secret agent. As he would often do when inventing characters for his books, Fleming simply lifted a name from real life. He looked at the distinctive white dust jacket of Birds of the West Indies on his bookshelf, noted the author's name in capital letters, and took it. James Bond. Period. No middle name, not even a middle initial. Just 9 purloined letters. A spy was born.
So also about the book, it is lavishly illustrated, and one of the challenges of the book was try to get as many really fascinating images as I could for the book. And the one in the upper right is a bird called the Cuban toady, and I was lucky enough to get that photo. Had found a postage stamp with James Bond on the right on the middle there, and there's also an Ian Fleming collection of short stories called For Your Eyes Only. And this one has this beautiful streamer tail hummingbird on the cover. And the short story begins with Ian Fleming spending the first 300 words just talking about how beautiful this bird is. And people don't realize that Fleming really was a birder, and he really did read Birds of the West Indies and went birding often. So I was very pleased when ornithologist Julie Zickafus wrote to me and said, if the real James Bond does nothing more than convince readers that an ornithologist can be something other than proper, stodgy, or dull, it will have done a great service. Unfortunately, part of the stereotype image of ornithologists as bird nerd came from James Bond himself. This came from a famous picture of him in the 1960s after he discovered a bird thought to be extinct. And here's James Bond smoking a pipe, wearing glasses, a bow tie, in a suit, holding 2 dead birds. It kind of reminded me of Wally Cox and Miss Jane Hathaway in the Beverly Hillbillies when I was a little kid. And they were always going bird watching, dressed kind of like the stereotypical bird nerds today. And I am a bird nerd myself, and I say it proudly. The one thing you need to know about Jim Bond was he grew up exceedingly rich. His mother was a Roebling of the Brooklyn Bridge building Roeblings, and that's her with her older son, Francis, and that's Jim Bond on the right. On the far right is Francis Bond, Jim's father. He was a founding partner of E.B. Smith, which later became Smith Barney, which made money the old-fashioned way. Francis was so wealthy, he at one point in 1903 was an owner of the Philadelphia Phillies. And James Bond, by the way, was born in 1900. So when Jim Bond was 3, his father owned the Phillies, a part owner. And that year they had a terrible calamity. They had wooden bleachers at the Baker Bowl. There was a fight outside the bleachers. They all congregated to see what the excitement was about. The bleachers collapsed. I think 12 people died, 70 were injured, and it was one of the worst accidents of its kind in American history to this day. Francis Bond was concerned about being sued, so he quickly sold his interest in the Phillies. The following year, the bad luck continued. Jim Bond's older sister, Maggie, died, I think, of a ruptured appendix. And the wealthy father was in Philadelphia, and he raced by special train and yacht to Dark Harbor in Maine in time to see her. And I think he made the trip from Philadelphia in 1904 in 7 hours. So that's how fast he traveled. After the tragedy, the Bonds tried to drown their sorrows. They moved out of Center City, Philadelphia, and built this estate in the suburbs in Gwynedd Valley. It is a huge mansion on 300 acres. And these days you can actually visit the mansion. It is on the campus of Gwynedd University, and it is the administration building, and you can go in there and see where the Bonds live. It's 300 acres, and it's an amazing place to go birding. And I think that's where Bond may have gotten the birding bug. So tragedy happened again shortly thereafter. Bond's mother died, and his father quickly remarried a British widow, gave her the mansion for a wedding present, and then moved the family to England, where Jim Bond went to Harrow and was bullied because of his American accent and a lot of cowboys and Indian jokes. He was just teased incessantly. But he stayed on. He later went to Cambridge, and in later life, he had sort of a British accent, even though he was an American. And it's kind of ironic that the British secret agent steals his name, and then he actually has a British accent himself. After Cambridge, Bond tried to be a banker, hated it, and he had a very small inheritance, and he realized that if he lived like a pauper and invested the money, what he had, he could work for free for the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences. And that's what he did. He became an ornithologist. And when the Depression hit, he was in a fortunate position because since he worked for nothing, they had no reason to fire him. When he came on at the Academy, he quickly fell in love with the idea of making his life's work the birds of the West Indies. And as you can see, that is a lot of water and a lot of islands. And Bond started traveling there. He would travel by the cheapest means necessary, including mail ships. When he got there, he traveled by banana boat, canoe. Actually, he was on a smuggler's rum runner one time to get to an island he had to get to. And part of the problem was that he got seasick when he traveled. So picking the West Indies was not probably the best career move, but he loved the birds down there so much that it became his life's work. When he got to the islands, it wasn't some really millionaire expedition with all kinds of porters and tents and everything. He traveled by himself, typically on foot or on horseback, and he stayed with the local people. This picture here is from the Zapata Swamp, and James Bond lived with the charcoal burners in a hut down there and lived off the same food they lived off of, which was the local rodent. The tools of Bond's trade. One of the cool things I discovered at the Academy of Natural Sciences was Bond's pocket knife. And they opened a blade for me and showed me it's etched for flesh only, which sounds like a great name for an Ian Fleming novel. He also used arsenic to preserve the birds, and he collected birds with a double-barreled shotgun and birdshot. I know it's a little troubling to see that. Just be advised that the biggest criticism of Bond was he did not shoot enough birds for the collections that were needed. And it turns out the birds he collected are now time capsules of the birds back then, and all kinds of information about the environment and the birds themselves is being gleaned to this day. And who knows what more will be available in 10 years as technology improves. The same thing can be said of eagle eggs and all kinds of bird eggs. They can tell you what the environment was like, and old nests are now invaluable for all sorts of reasons, including they can tell us when invasive species arrived at that location because they suddenly started appearing in nests that the birds were building. So after 10 years, Jim Bond publishes Birds of the West Indies. He took it first to Lippincott, the big Philadelphia publisher, and Joe Lippincott himself said in 1936, "Sorry, this is something for the museums, not for a publisher." So the Academy of Natural Sciences themselves published it. Turns out that Joe Lippincott was wrong. The book in its various editions stayed in print for more than 6 decades. And there's so many editions of this book, I've lost track. I've tried to buy as many as I can, and I have a full bookshelf. The one on the left is the Field Guide to Birds of the West Indies. That's the 1947 edition, and that sold last November. It was signed by Bond. It sold for $5,000. So these books are increasingly valuable. I also wanted to talk about Carroll S. Tyson Jr., and he was Bond's uncle. He had 2 places on Mount Desert Island, one on Long Pond, the hunting camp, and he had a place in Northeast Harbor overlooking the Astakoo Inn. Carroll Tyson was also wealthy. He married a Roebling as well, and he had his own money. He met his wife when he was hired to paint her portrait. And it was kind of a love at first sight thing, and he became a renowned painter. Paul Quarry is part of the White House collection, and he unfortunately, there's no avoiding it. Carroll Tyson's more famous for a painting he bought than a painting he owned, than a painting he painted, I'm sorry. So Carroll Tyson's doing a buying expedition to Europe, sees Van Gogh's sunflowers, and I think there's 7 variations of this painting in the entire world. Tyson bought sunflowers, brings it home, and decides he really doesn't like it. So he puts it behind his seat at the dining room table so he won't have to look at it. And I think that's the definition of wealth, is when you have sunflowers in your house and you don't really want to look at it. I should mention, by the way, that sunflowers is now at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's the only sunflowers in all of North America, and you can see it at the museum anytime. The Tysons graciously donated that Van Gogh and a lot of other incredibly valuable paintings. So kudos to them. This is Birchcroft in Northeast Harbor, and that's where Tyson and his wife and Jim Bond in Bond's teen years lived. And it was one time on the porch of Birchcroft, Carroll Tyson was tromping through with all his messy oils, and his wife said, "Carroll, you're interrupting our bridge game. This is a big mess." She got this idea. She went out and bought the best watercolors, the best brushes, and the best paper she could find, and said, "Do something with these." And Tyson and his nephew, Jim Bond, came up with the idea of painting 20 birds of Mount Desert Island. Jim Bond would collect the birds and help them pose, and then Carol Tyson would paint them. And if you've been around Mount Desert Island, chances are you've seen these fine arts prints. They are marvelous. You can go to Northeast Harbor Library and see all 20. And believe me, it is a treat, and I urge you to go visit the library and check it out. So here's what the 20 birds of Mount Desert Island looked like. It came in this big red portfolio, and it's a real treat. I saw these prints without frames for the first time last month, and the printing is so exquisite, you think they were the actual watercolors. This is Great Gray Owl, done by Carol Tyson. This is the Snowy Owl, and I'm told this is the jewel in the crown. I think it's on sale this week at an auction house for, I think the bidding starts at $16,000 for this incredible painting with a fish that on the rocks there, and there's some sailboats in the background. If you get a chance to see this in person, it is terrific. I love this pileated woodpecker print, especially. The picture on the right, I took last month in the nature preserve where I live. And I flipped out when I saw that same flying wood painted by Tyson. And he didn't have a photo to work with. He had to do that just from the skill of being an artist. And I love that print. The other thing about these prints that fascinated me is there's so much detail. These are red starts, but if you look closely on the right, you will see an eastern tiger swallowtail. And when I was up on the island last week, I saw plenty of those. And there's also a hummingbird clearwing moth in the print too. So it's very Audubon-like, and that's one of the reasons Tyson's called the Audubon of Maine. So Tyson and James Bond also collaborated on The Birds of Mount Desert Island, Acadia National Park, Maine, published in 1941 by the Academy of Natural Sciences. And this is like no other bird guide I've ever seen. It's a slender volume, it'll fit in your pocket. And Tyson and Bond had a real sense of humor when they wrote it. And incredible local knowledge. This was one of my favorites. The tree swallow, that's a common resident on the island. It nests in hollow trees or in birdhouses erected for its use. For the last 5 years, a pair has nested in Ole Richardson's letterbox on Town Hill. So I don't know how many bird guides give you that specific instruction on how to see a bird. And also they have some humor in there. The crow is well known and widespread on Mount Desert Island, where it is jokingly referred to by some of the natives as soup meat. Once again, not your average field guide. And belted kingfishers are my other favorite. And I know you get them up on Mount Desert Island, and we get them in the nature preserve near me. Just charismatic birds. And I think Tyson really captures the feel of these crazy young birds. So Ian Fleming steals James Bond's name, and I found this film clip in which he confesses to the crime. So listen in.
Mr. Fleming, how does an author tackle the problem of selecting a name for the hero of his stories?
Well, it isn't only the hero. I mean, I generally pick up names just driving through the countryside, through villages and so on. You'll see an interesting name over a tobacconist or chemist or something of that sort in any country in the world. But when I started to write these books in 1952, I wanted to find a name which wouldn't have any of this romantic overtones like Peregrine Carruthers or whoever it might be. I wanted a really flat, quiet name. And one of my Bibles out here is James Bond's Birds of the West Indies. which is a very famous ornithological book indeed. And I thought, well, now, James Bond, now that's a pretty quiet name. And so I simply stole it and used it.
And a spy was born. The trouble was that Fleming stole the name in 1952, but the 007 phenomenon didn't really cross the pond until the early 1960s when John Kennedy became president and he announced that one of his favorite books was From Russia with Love. Late at night, Bond and his wife started getting late night calls from young, breathless females going, "Hello, could I speak to James, please?" And they finally found out through a friend. Fleming confessed in an interview with a men's magazine that he had stolen the real James Bond's name. Mary Bond wrote to Fleming accusing him of the theft, and Fleming fessed up to it and said, you know, if you're ever in Jamaica, please stop by and see me. And although Jim Bond wasn't really thrilled with this whole connection, Mary Bond warmed up to it. And she accepted the invitation and showed up with Jim Bond unexpectedly one day in February 1964, the one and only time Bond and Fleming met. And when Fleming answered the door, he was a little nervous and said, "You're not here to sue me, are you?" And James Bond said, "No, I really don't even like your books." And Fleming said, "I don't blame you." And they hit it off and spent the rest of the day together with their wives. And at the end of the day, Fleming pulled out his latest book, and it was You Only Live Twice, and he signed it to the real James Bond from the thief of his identity, Ian Fleming, February 5th, 1964, a great day. And so just as Ian Fleming stole James Bond's name, I sort of stole the inscription from Ian Fleming's dedication to James Bond and use it for the title of my book. So increasingly, as James Bond and 007 craze just went, it was insane in the United States. Back then, like half the TV shows were Get Smart, Man from U.N.C.L.E., The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., I Spy, the list just wild, wild west. Every show was this spy craze, all spawned by 007. And although Mary Bond liked it, James Bond really got sick of it and in a hurry. Once Goldfinger hit especially, a lot of jokes about how do you want your martini? Are you hiding your gun? All those jokes. So Bond grew very tired of it. And in 1965, just after Goldfinger was out, he discovered a bird thought to be extinct. It was the Eskimo curlew. Hunter found it in Barbados and thought it looked very unusual. So he saved it for Bond. Bond took one look at it and said, "That's an Eskimo curlew. It's supposed to have been extinct 15 years ago." So he did the research, wrote a paper on it, and when the news came out, typically it would be covered by the Smithsonian or Scientific American and the ornithological journals. But now that James Bond wasn't just an ornithologist, but the namesake of a secret agent, the newspapers across the country picked it up. And this is just a sample of all the headlines that were out and about when Bond found this rare bird. This James Bond catches birds instead of villains. His name is James Bond, and this one's for the birds. And you know, every bird joke you can think of. Just think that was like the worst for Bond when that happened. Bond died in 1989, and it was probably a good thing he wasn't around in 2002 when Pierce Brosnan played James Bond in Die Another Day. And here's a scene. He's walking into a bar in Havana, carrying the Birds of the West Indies by the other James Bond. And I'm going to have a scene here from it. And if you notice right away, this ornithologist is smoking a cigar while looking at birds through binoculars. So gives you an idea of the expertise involved. Here's Brosnan and Halle Berry.
Magnificent view.
It is, isn't it? Too bad it's lost on everybody else.
Mojito? You should try it.
Jacinta Johnson. Our friends call me Jinx.
My friends call me James Bond. Jinx, you say?
Born on Friday the 13th.
You believe in bad luck?
Let's just say our relationships don't seem to last.
I know the feeling. The predators usually appear at sunset.
And why is that?
It's when their prey comes out to drink. Too strong for you?
I can learn to like it, if I have the time.
How much time have you got?
Until dawn. What about you?
Oh, I'm just here for the birds. Ornithologist.
So little known fact, Die Another Day actually won an Oscar for the cheesiest dialogue. So gotten lost in all of this is Bond the Conservationist. He's always remembered, if he's remembered at all, as the namesake of 007, but he was definitely a conservationist. And if you read that very first Birds of the West Indies, he wrote in the introduction all kinds of things that were ahead of their time. He was concerned about the cutting down of rainforests for plantations. He was worried about the wholesale shooting of birds. He wanted to establish national parks where hunting was absolutely prohibited. He fought against the illegal parrot trade. All these issues are still with us today. He wrote that there can be no doubt that the principal factor that has resulted in the extinction or rarity of so many West Indian birds is man. And the 1947 edition of Birds of the West Indies, he actually has an ivory-billed woodpecker on the back cover. And this is the only field guide I know of that has a drawing of a bird that no one's probably going to see because there's so few left in the entire West Indies. At this point, they're located in one small patch of Cuba, and I believe they're extinct there as well. So Bond also collected some amazing critters for science. He would travel to the West Indies to collect birds and research all their nesting habits and that sort of thing. But while he was there, he collected crickets, hundreds of fish, eggs, you name it. He was an omnivore when it came to collecting. And all these specimens are in collections across the country today, including the top natural history museums. These are a pair of harpy eagle eggs that Bond collected before he went to the West Indies. He went to Brazil and actually collected these two harpy eagle eggs. These are the only two known to be found in the wild that are now in a museum. So they are invaluable for research purposes. And the other thing, because of his book, Bond really popularized the birds of the West Indies for generations of travelers. This is that hummingbird that was on the cover of For Your Eyes Only, and that's the bird that Fleming adored, the national bird of Jamaica. And there's another view of it. It is a spectacular bird. It was called the doctor bird in Jamaica because it looked like the long coattails of the doctors back in the day. And of course, it has that incredibly long tails and that red-billed, just a spectacular bird. Bond also wrote about tling-tlings, and so did Ian Fleming. If you read The Man with the Golden Gun, tling-tlings play a huge role in it. Usually, when you see a bird in a Ian Fleming novel, it typically does not meet a good end, usually at the hands of a villain. the klingklings here, I saw when I went to visit Goldeneye, and the klingklings are these mischievous grackles, and they were at the hotel bar outside at the beach, and they were unraveling the napkins when we got there. And I just thought that was perfect, that 50 years after Ian Fleming dies, the klingklings are still around, still misbehaving. Also the Bahama parrot, which is, I just checked, and there's still some of these around. It was thought to be extinct until James Bond bummed a ride on a rum runner, went to Abaco, and rediscovered these birds. So it's kind of a sad ending here, but James Bond and his wife lived at Pretty Marsh on MDI during the summers for many, many years. And near the end of his life, Bond had cancer, and he and Mary would go to Pretty Marsh, watch the tides roll in and out through the fog. And this was really a curative thing for them. He was diagnosed with cancer in the mid-1970s, and in part because of Pretty Marsh and the solitude they found there, he lived another 10 years till 1989. So part of his legacy, he brought us here today to talk about birds, art, and Mount Desert Island. And I thank you all for listening. There's some signed copies of my book available at the Wendell Gilley Museum. And you can also check out my blog, my realjamesbond.net. I should have mentioned, if you have questions for me, type it into the chat box, and I will try to answer them. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I hope to talk with some of you. Thank you.
Jim, that's terrific. Thank you so much for sharing that story with us. It's really fun to see the various connections to Mount Desert Island, but also, you know, just the amazing body of work that was produced in terms of, you know, what we know today, largely due to all of the, or part of the work that James Bond did to collect all of those specimens. Fascinating. So a couple of questions in the chat. For those of you who have questions, please feel free to type them in and we will relay them to our speaker. One question that just came in is, out of curiosity, where the Bonds lived in Pretty Marsh. Do you have a sense of, in general, where that is?
I think not far from the Pretty Marsh picnic area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was there last week, and we didn't get near the house, but I have seen it, and it's beautiful. It's right on the bay there. It's really not a marsh, but it's a spectacular place and a great place to go birding. I'm not surprised the Bonds lived there, because at the Acadia Birding Festival, that one of the most popular walks is the Pretty Marsh Walk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a beautiful spot. Another question is, where is James Bond buried?
He is buried outside of Philadelphia at the Church of the Messiah in Gwinnett Valley, and Mary is right next to him. And the church itself has a stained glass window that Bond's father dedicated to Bond's mother. And it's not all that far from that wonderful estate, Willowbrook, which is now the university.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And another question, where are most of his specimens still at the Natural Academy of Sciences in Philadelphia?
Yeah, so they have some at the Peabody Museum at Yale, many at Harvard. The American Museum of Natural History in New York City has several, and the bulk of them are at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, which is an amazing place. Not sure if they still have it up, but when the book came out, they had an exhibition, a couple showcases, including some of the birds that James Bond collected. One of the birds, kind of tragic, was the Bahama nuthatch, and he thought it was a subspecies of the nuthatch we find in the southeast United States. A couple of recent hurricanes have wiped out the bird as far as we know, and now researchers think it's a separate species that Bond had found only after it became extinct. So it's kind of a tragic story and a reminder how our birds are in peril these days with climate change and habitat loss and all the other problems.
Fascinating. So one listener would like to know a little bit more about James Bond's wife, Mary, and just curious if she was a birder as well.
Yes, so James Bond and Mary Bond were birders, and Mary Bond was doing one of her novels, and she was married to a guy named Shippen Lewis at the time, and she was writing this book called Desire and something else, and one of the characters is this handsome ornithologist. It sounds a lot like James Bond. And later on, after her husband died, she started seeing Jim Bond driving around Mount Desert Island in the summer, driving a red sports car. And she said everyone thought he was a real catch. And she caught him in 1952. And I have to tell you, the more I know about Mary Bond, the more I'm in love with her. She is such a character. When Bond was having his problems with cancer, she had written some books called To James Bond with Love and all these other books. She was capitalizing on the connection. And she visits the doctor with Bond and says, by the way, would you like a copy of my book? I'll sign it for you. And he says, sure, that would be great. So she goes out to the receptionist, signs the book, hands it to her and says, that'll be $15. And the doctor had the last laugh because the book is now worth like $250 signed, and he only got it for 15. But that's the kind of promoter she was, just tireless and apparently loved every minute of it.
That's great. Did James Bond have a favorite bird that you know of, or what ones did he talk about most frequently?
Ooh, that's a good question. I know he loved the birds from the Zapata swamp, and this former soldier from the Spanish-American War was in Cuba and discovered 3 new species in the Zapata swamp, and the Academy sent Bond down to see if he could confirm the discoveries and get some specimens himself. And he did all kinds of research, made several trips to Cuba, and it was really nasty business getting down there. It's, mosquito infested swamps, all kinds of problems. And I said he lived off eating the local rodents, but the Zapata birds are world famous, and Bond helped establish their credentials. So I think he was very proud of that. And of course, the Bahama nuthatch as well.
Interesting. So there's another question. A camp on Long Pond is mentioned in the 1941 Birds of Mount Desert Island. Do you know where that camp was on the lake?
I did. And I think that my gut tells me it was it would be at 5 o'clock on the lake. And I think it is now privately owned by other than the Tyson family. But it's a beautiful place, and it's a big, beautiful house on Long Pond.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that Bond, liked to bird in Pretty Marsh. Were there other favorite spots on Mount Desert Island that you're aware of that he and Mary liked to bird?
Well, Pretty Marsh especially, and I think Long Pond too, because of Carol Tyson being there. And near Tyson's house in Northeast Harbor, at Astaku, there's this amazing azalea garden there. And my wife and I birded there like 10 days ago, and I'm sure Bond must have birded there as well. We had cedar waxwings and warblers, just a great place. And I'm sure that Bond was aware of that as well.
Mm-hmm. In the book, Jim, you talk a lot about the preservation of these specimens that were collected and the use of arsenic in preserving them, and sort of how that, changed over time. I'm just curious, did Bond ever have any health issues from, dealing with so much arsenic? I know others, prior to him did.
Yes, they did. I guess he did come down with cancer, in his mid 70s, but he did live to be 89. So I think he did okay.
Interesting. So sort of a related question here, but what are some of the reasons for which birds or eggs are still collected today, and are they being collected today?
I think there's a kind of a debate on the need for this. And the thing about collecting birds, some of the birds are very hard to distinguish. And if you just take photos of them and say that's the bird, it just would not be helpful to anybody. And now they collect DNA, they find all kinds of information about the environment, what the bird was like back in the 1920s. One of the things they found, they proved that DDT was ruining the eggs, was they had eggs collected before DDT, and they found the eggs were much thinner because the DDT was leaching out the calcium, that sort of thing. I think I mentioned the nests they collected. You could find out when invasive species arrived in this country, or at least that area, by the birds started using them in their nests. As one ornithologist told me, you know, every year we learn more and more through the technology and the DNA about these birds, and things we never imagined we could find out, we're now finding out. So these collections are becoming more and more valuable, if anything. Ornithologists get lumped in with the crazy bird collectors, and these guys would shoot birds by the hundreds. In my book, I write about that, this the millinery craze and the taxidermy craze. Authors were telling, ornithologist authors were saying, you know, shoot as many birds as you like, except for the rare ones, and only maybe 50 or so. And the ones that the ornithologists collect for science are a drop in the bucket, you know, compared to what more birds get killed by window strikes and cats every day than probably ornithologists collect in a year. So I think what they collected is invaluable to science. And you have to make a distinction between just wholesale killing of birds for the millinery trade, or if you like to have a stuffed one on your mantle, and what scientists do.
Absolutely. Interesting. Is Bond's book on birds of Magellanic Island still available?
You know, I try to buy every copy I see, and I've only found one. There's another one called The Checklist of the Birds of Mount Desert Island, and trying to find one, but you can still buy them on occasion, and they sell for a pretty penny as well. They're just not quite the same. They're still excellent.
Interesting. You know, I was thinking a little bit about the kind of, you know, Bond's experience and the fact that in the sort of early 20th century, you know, the idea of citizen science was largely reserved for the wealthy, right, who had the ability to do that. And today, it just seems like, you know, we have iNaturalist and iBird, and just anyone with an iPhone can go out and, you know, be an observer of nature. I'm just curious, do you have thoughts about kind of what the future looks like for this kind of, you know, the kind of work? What would James Bond have thought about, you know, the ability to go out and just capture that with your iPhone?
I think he would be amazed. I think one thing would happen is, I don't think people would be shooting birds to paint them anymore. Right. Like Audubon and Carol Tyson. And with the photography you can get now, it is unbelievable with digital photography and the instant access to identification between there's an app called Merlin. If you're a birder and you don't have Merlin, get it. You can just take a picture of a bird, show it, and it will tell you what the bird is. And you know, when I write my birding columns, I always put the picture of the bird on Merlin first, just to make sure I don't misidentify it. That's my biggest fear, is to write a birding column and have the wrong bird. And some of these birds do look quite alike.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Someone, one of our listeners asks if you are available to talk to bird clubs.
Yes, absolutely. Especially by Zoom these days. And I can wear a mask or not, depending on whether you'd like me to. But yeah, that's the one thing about the pandemic, you know, in terms of authors, we just can't go, and I would love to speak to you guys in person. That would be a dream. But the next best thing is being able to talk to you via Zoom and it sort of spread the word about James Bond and his accomplishments. And I can reach, I can talk to you on Mount Desert Island, even though I'm not there this week. And I've talked to groups in Chicago, British Columbia, all over the place, just because of Zoom. So be happy to speak to other bird groups as well. And you can just drop me an email. That would be great.
That's fantastic. And you may have seen this comment in the chat, but there was a listener who said that Jim and Mary Bond were good friends with her parents. So
Wow.
she said, but despite that, she learned a lot of new information about them. So
Yeah, that
that's
would
great.
be a guess. I've heard the nicest things about Jim Bond from people who live on Mount Desert Island. And Carol Tyson's his chauffeur, the grandson and granddaughter met Jim Bond once, and they said just how lovely and amazing a guy he was, and just how personable he was. He looks kind of nerdy and cold, but a lot of people thought he was a great guy. So I wish I could have met him, and I'm a little jealous when I hear people who have, and the people I've talked to on Mount Desert Island who met him, and it's like being with a legend,
Mm. Well, that's great. Well, thank you for bringing him to life for all of us this evening. It was wonderful, and I can't wait to finish the rest of the book. So thank you so much for writing it.
And I just want to thank everyone, and thank you, Jerry, for hosting this. It's much appreciated.
Well, thanks for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.